So now the question becomes, what about sustained inquiry, authenticity, and student voice and choice? Let me introduce myself again to you. My name is Myla Lee, and I am a coach and consultant for project-based learning and tech integration and literacy. I have been in education for over 30 years. 26 has been within a classroom setting, and the rest has been as an instructional coach and PBL specialist. One of the other hats I wear is that I am a national faculty for PBLWorks, and I work with organizations that really focus on learner-centered practices and creating that culture within the school setting. So let's take a moment and let's go back to this graphic again. We talked about in our last video about the learning goals and how key knowledge, understanding, and success skills need to be the center in terms of our project design, and how the other 7 elements lead into and support the learning that happens within a project. I want to mention, we talked about sustained inquiry, authenticity, and student voice and choice. But when I think about those 3 elements in particular, as well as all the other design elements, I always have this visual of tapestry where each of them could be a thread in how they are interwoven together to create this. So as I speak about each of these design elements almost in isolation, I want you to keep in mind that really they influence and affect and impact all the other elements as well. So, and I'm sure you'll get to see that, especially as I start talking about each of these elements, that you'll be able to see how one element can actually impact the other in terms of student engagement, as well as the quality that it's brought out within a project. So, first step, how can we sustain inquiry? And when I think about inquiry, I think of curiosity, and the word curiosity comes into my mind. So again, I'm going to lift and take the language from the project design rubric. And I'm going to give you a moment to really think through this and read through it as I read it to you. Inquiry is sustained over time and academically rigorous. Students pose questions, gather and interpret data, develop and evaluate solutions, or build evidence for answers and ask further questions. Inquiry is driven by student-generated questions throughout the project. So let's go back to our project path here. This is based on PBLWorks' path. So if we think about the project launch, that is where our first point of inquiry happens within a project. It's launched, and that's where our first where the first part of the curiosity happens for our students within a project. We're talking about the entry event. You know, the entry event is the activity or the experience that students have when they start a project that sparks that inquiry process. Again, it sparks the curiosity, and it actually is connected to the learning. So it's not this one-off experience. It actually leads to that driving question. And it might actually introduce the context of the final product or presentation. So my question to you is, how might you create opportunities in your project to spark curiosity, to engage students to question, and to collaborate and to discuss, to hear different perspectives? I say this now because you start with your entry event, it sparks that. But again, it's sustained inquiry. How can you sustain that same curiosity that you sparked in the entry event, and create the opportunities for questioning as well as when I say collaborate and discuss, because when students have an opportunity to collaborate and discuss, they might hear different perspectives, which spark even more curiosity and critical thinking. Here are some examples, and let me just say these are examples. This is not the list that you are to go only by. Again, it's anything that will spark curiosity. So some examples might be a lively discussion. Creating a discussion where it is actually pushing thinking, where it is engaging students with topics that normally would not be discussed in a normal classroom setting, topics from that are important to students, lively discussions that can spark curiosity. That can be an entry event or moments throughout the project itself that can continue the inquiry. A piece of real or mock correspondence. Now, I always shy away from sometimes the mock correspondence because unless you are really upfront with students later on that it is a simulation, because the more authentic you have it, you don't want to let your students down thinking, my teacher wasn't honest with me. So I tend to go with more authentic pieces when it comes to correspondence or letters. A puzzling problem or dilemma. Maybe it's just a dilemma that's happening within your own school. Maybe it's a dilemma that's happening in your community or even in the world. A startling statistic or data. Sometimes a great graph or some data that is in existence that you might find in an infographic or some kind of visual that causes students to question if the statistic is or the information is true or whether it isn't. A simulation, having them go through a simulation and then processing that. Field trips. So many times field trips are at the end of a project. A lot of my teachers that do project-based learning have now moved it within their project or even at the very beginning of their project. Guest speaker and expert. A guest speaker and expert to not tell them all the information, but to spark curiosity. And here's a management tip. If you have a guest speaker or expert, I suggest if you can video them or record them in any way, that is a great tip that a friend told me about. And so when I had guest speakers and experts in, I would record it some way and so when students who were absent could go back to it, or if my students who were there needed to spark their curiosity again, I would play it for them. And then another example that you could use is a captivating headline or reading, a headline from a newspaper, or reading such as a poem that allows the senses to be engaged and stimulated. So anything that can capture their attention, preferably through emotions, will capture them to want to engage in the learning. So as you think about your project-based learning path here, think about where in this can I create moments for them to question, because that's how you're going to sustain inquiry. And we talked about those different examples, not limited to, but those examples that might help that. I always say whatever type of experience that results in students questioning and wanting to discover more are great examples of sustained inquiry activities that you can use within your project. So let's go back to our tiny house project example. My question to you, how do you think the teacher sparked curiosity and sustained inquiry throughout this project? Take a moment, pause the video, and just reflect on that. So some examples that I want to think about here is the Minecraft entry event activity. Okay, that was a great entry event activity. It connected to the students, it engaged them, and it made them, she followed up with questions to create more questions for those students. She brought in an expert architect, and there were lively group discussions so students could hear other students and their perspectives. So that allowed for students to question and think about what their perspective was and how it related to other people's ideas. They critiqued each other's designs, and they brought in clients that they had to question, not only question whether or not they had the correct information, but the clients could even question them. So those were ways that this particular teacher helped sustain that inquiry throughout the project, from beginning all the way to the end. Now, authenticity. How authentic does the project need to be? Well, it depends. Again, here is the language from the rubric. The project has an authentic context. It involves real-world tasks, tools, and quality standards, making an impact on the world and/or speaks to students' personal concerns, interests, or identities. So when I think about a product, an authentic product, I think about this little formula here. I think about who uses the standard. If I'm thinking what kind of learning I want my students to engage in or to learn, the content standard, the key knowledge, okay, I ask who uses it in the real world and in what context are they used? So do they use it within, when thinking about a project, do they use it in the office? Where do they use it? And how are those standards used? How do they actually apply it to their roles? So those are the things I consider because it helps me in thinking about the product. Like what kind of product would be authentic to how the person would use that standard or that learning in the real world. So when I think about authenticity, I think about the people, the process, which might include the tools that are being used, the actual skills involved with that, and the product, the final outcome. What do these people actually use through this? So there's a great blog post, an article in PBLWorks by John Larmer. The question is, what does it take for a project to be authentic? I really like this because it really gives you a spectrum of authenticity, keeping in mind that maybe a more complex project that has authenticity in terms of people, process, and product, in which it makes complete impact on the world and the community, that would be more of a sophisticated, authentic project. But one that might just have an authentic person coming in, or maybe just the tools, might be more of a simplistic version of authenticity. Regardless, some form of authenticity exists within the project. And again, it really depends on where you're at in terms of project-based learning. Are you first starting out, or have you are you more experienced within project-based learning that you can take on the complexity of having a truly authentic project? Some examples of products: brochures, letters, editorials. These are some examples that you might see in the real world. But keep in mind, if you choose brochure, is that an authentic product that you could use with that learning that happens? Is that something that you generally would see in the real world with that particular person or the tools that they're using. Okay, so keep in mind as you're going through that, how it's actually used. But these are some examples that you might see in the real world as well that your students can produce. So let's go back to the tiny house project. How was the tiny house project authentic? People, process, or product? Again, pause your video, take a moment to reflect. So as I was thinking about the tiny house project, the people, there were clients, there were architects, the process, they were drafting, designing, using area and perimeter. They had feedback from peers, which is part of the process of an architect. They had a presentation to a client, and their product was a scaled model, and there was a presentation that went along with it. So, what does student voice and choice look like in a project? I like to think about it, the personality. It's the student's personality coming out in the project. I'm going to lift up the language again from the rubric. Student voice and choice. Students have opportunities to express their voice and make choices on important matters. Students have opportunities to take significant responsibility and work as independently from the teacher as is appropriate with guidance. So I want you to think about how that and reflect on what that might mean and look like within your own classroom practice right now. So when I think about student voice and choice, that you're giving students topics to investigate, questions are asked, so students are given the opportunity to ask questions. There are texts and resources to be used, so they have choices within that. They can have a choice of who they can work with, and then the products that they create, and the use of their time, how they use their time in the organization of tasks. So that can actually fit under different categories of the process and the product. Now, how much voice and choice should I have in a project? Really, that depends. And again, I always err on the side of, if it's your first project, you don't have to have a whole menu of different products for them to choose from. You can still have voice and choice with one product or one or two products, and give them voice and choice through the process. Because what happens is when you give almost too much voice and choice in your initial first project and you haven't experienced managing a project, what usually happens is that it becomes a management nightmare. So I always say start simple. Even with one product, they can have voice and choice in terms of how they show their creativity within it, and also all the other pieces throughout the project itself, the process. So let's go back to the tiny house project. How did the students demonstrate their voice and choice in this project? Take a moment, pause your video for a couple minutes to reflect. Think about the video if you need to. If you need to watch it again, do so. Here are just some examples of how voice and choice existed within this project. Students had design choice. They had lively discussions. Again, lively discussions with authenticity and having inquiry. Again, you're seeing that how they're actually affecting and interwoven together, the different elements. They had routines and protocols for equitable participation. Okay. And then how they used feedback with each other. They had a choice. Feedback, they did receive feedback, but how they used it was up to them. So again, think about how this can exist within your project. Voice and choice. Where within the project path itself can you think about how your students can exhibit their choice and their voice within the project? So thanks again for spending some time with me to talk about authenticity, student voice and choice, and sustained inquiry. You can keep in touch with me on Twitter, also on my website.